The first thing that we're going to start with is our art talk, which is one of my favorite things. Um, and Sarah Kane is going to present on Remington and Russell. And this is a genre of art that I personally am very attached to. It's part of the history of the Wild Wild West. If you grew up watching James West, or if John Wayne and Rooster Cogburn, or any of those shows, you got to have an attachment to the romance of the Wild Wild West and the grit that so many people had just crossing the country. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Sarah, and she's going to tell us quite a bit more about all of this. Sarah, over to you.
Hi, everyone. So this week we're focusing on Remington and Russell. This right here is Frederic Remington. So Frederic Remington and Charles Russell were two American artists of the late 19th, early 20th century. And living in a post-Civil War era, many Americans were looking to travel west. And both of their art reflected, the vast plains and landscapes of the West, Native Americans, explorers, wildlife, just amongst others. So I'd like to give a little separate background on each artist. And I will preface this with both of them had very long, extensive careers. They each made thousands of works, whether it was paintings, watercolors, sculptures. They were both writers. So this is going to be an intro, but we're going to kind of notice some similarities and differences between the two. So Frederic Remington was born in 1861 in Canton, New York. His father was a Union Army officer in the Civil War and was very involved in politics. Remington has a family relation to George Catlin, Earl W. Bascom, and Frank Tenney Johnson, all of whom were also artists focusing on Native Americans, cowboys, and the West in general. So Remington's career was definitely in his blood. He attended the art school at Yale University and was one of the only males in his class, which I find funny because you think about in most other majors, women probably weren't allowed to enroll. He actually didn't enjoy formal art training and eventually left to tend to his ill father. At 19, he finally made the decision to take his first trip out west and went to Montana. And this is something that makes his art unique because he was able to explore and experience the West in 1881, which is kind of how we still think of it today, almost this cowboys and Indians type scene probably playing out in some of your heads right now. So even 20 or so years later, when other artists came west, it had already lost some of the authentic kind of historical aspect. So he traveled to Kansas and acquired a ranch, thinking that, he wanted to be a rancher. It turned out not to be for him. He sold his ranch 3 years later and became a part owner in a saloon, often drawing sketches of the saloon patrons. After garnering more attention with his art, he decided to move back east. He went to Brooklyn with his wife and began classes at the Art Students League to kind of freshen up his technique. And he was able to solidify a steady career as images and paintings of the dying West kind of came into fashion towards the late 19th century. So let's talk about Russell now. So here he is. So Charles Russell. So Russell was born in St. Louis, Missouri in 1864. And he always had a fascination with the Wild West. As a child, he grew up sketching and making clay figures of animals. A fun fact, he even learned to ride horses on a famous Civil War horse named Great Britain. And at 16, he decided he wanted to be a rancher. The ranch life was definitely for him. So he quit school, moved up to Montana, and worked on a sheep ranch. So while working as a rancher and a cowboy at a number of different ranches, he would sketch and paint watercolors of his surroundings. And a shop owner in a nearby town actually displayed one of his watercolor postcards, and Russell began to receive different commissions for his art. He also lived with the Blood Indians of the Blackfeet Nation for a bit and gained really intimate knowledge of Native American life. And he eventually settled with his wife in Great Falls, Montana, and began life as a full-time artist. So let's look at some art. Okay. So between 1885 and 1889, Remington made several trips to the Southwest to document the Apache Wars. And he took note of the special quality of light that he experienced, which is reflected in this painting called A Dash for the Timber, done in 1889. To me, the most amazing part of this painting is the shadows underneath the horses. It gives the painting such a sense of urgency and movement that kind of exemplifies the wildness of this landscape. This is currently at the Carter Museum in Fort Worth, Texas, and they use the word cinematic to describe this painting, which I think is just the perfect word. This could easily be, you know, the cover poster for a Wild West movie. And at this time in his career, Remington was living back in New York, and this painting actually kind of won him acclaim as one of New York's best new illustrators. So on to Russell now. Moving camps or breaking camp was one of Russell's favorite scenes to depict. So this is called Seeking New Hunting Ground, painted in 1891. And it's almost photographic detail. Show the men of the tribe riding ahead and guarding the women, children, and possessions following behind. And you can see it's kind of a similar style landscape to Remington's, but with the Native Americans as the focus. It's kind of a serene, calm scene as opposed to Remington's wild and fast-paced shootout. So as I mentioned, both artists had a plethora of styles they created in, so I definitely wanted to focus on some of their sculpture work. So this is a picture of one of only two busts that Remington made in his career. This is called The Savage, done in 1908, and mirrors his other bust called The Sergeant, done in 1904. So obviously these two busts represent, they represent kind of stereotypes and highlight the cultural and racial biases that are, you know, further ingrained by, you know, the choice of titles, the savage, obviously. So the exaggerated features, the defiant expression represent an attitude and a kind of common conception that Remington had about Native people throughout his career. And both of these busts are housed at the Met in New York. So if we look at one of Russell's sculptures, not a bust, but this is actually his first sculpture he ever did, which is amazing. This was done in 1905 called Buffalo Hunt. And buffalo hunting was kind of an elusive and rare event at this point in time, as much of the buffalo population that used to sustain Plains Indians had been depleted. So Russell never actually witnessed one, but he uses the stories told to him while living with the Blackfeet Nation Indians to create this really intricate sculpture. Russell was a master at observing animal behavior. Remember, I mentioned before that even as a child, he was making little animal sculptures. And this sculpture is really a study of anatomy, from you can see the muscles of the horse to the hairs on the bison's back. And his career and experience of being a wrangler and a rancher really lent itself to the specificity of his 3D works. The sculpture is actually also at the Met in New York. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to include a link in the chat to an exhibit that was held in 2015 at the Sid Richardson Museum in Fort Worth. The exhibit is called Remington and Russell Retold. If you're interested in exploring some of their works further, it kind of highlights, you know, the similarities and the differences throughout their careers. So it's actually not documented that the two artists ever met, but they were both very aware of each other and their careers. And Russell actually worked with Frank Tenney Johnson that I mentioned prior, who was related to Remington. So they had very interconnected careers and were both very influential in portraying the American West at the time. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. It's always interesting. Each one of your presentations is always very interesting, and the artwork is always very engaging. Does anybody have any questions for Sarah? Well, while everybody's thinking about that, I actually had one. You know, something I had read, I believe that they had actually moved all the way west, not moved, but had been all the way west. I know there was some work that they did out in Arizona that was unique to Arizona. Is there anything specific about California that you're aware of?
I didn't see anything specific to California. I can definitely look more into that and see if there were any works or influences if they spent any time there, and I can report back next week.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Does anybody else have any questions for Sarah? All right. Well, thank you, Sarah. Always a pleasure.
Thank you, everyone.